Hello and welcome back to On the Soul's Terms podcast. I'm your host, Chris Skidmore. Thanks a lot for joining me today. And today we're going to make the journey into the 11th house, 11 of 12 houses. So we're coming right towards the end of our journey through the houses. And the 11th is a particularly interesting house to enter, as it is no longer really such a personal house. In some ways, when we got to the 10th house, as we explored last time, we reached somewhat of a pinnacle of the individual, of the personal experience, and we reached the midheaven. So we got all the way up to the top of the chart and explored what it was to be in our calling and who we are as individuals, and really unfolding, as we talked about in that episode. We went all the way from the roots of the IC up and out through the MC, and there was this sort of flowering out into the 9th house and the 10th house, the 9th being our philosophies and our understandings of reality, and our 10th being that calling and who we're supposed to be in the world, and creating from that deep genius or that daimon, and really letting it flourish. But when we enter the 11th house, we enter a much less personal house, and we get to ask ourselves, well, how is this self that I have created and that I have moved through and gone with all the way from that first house, from that very first seed, that very first moment of birth, and receiving a body and receiving instructions from the other side, or whatever happened through all of those initiations. All 10 houses got us to this particular point. But then the question becomes, how can I offer this to the community at large, to bigger groups, to a bigger collective? So we move, in a sense, once we move to the 11th and then 12th houses, we move further away from the individual and the individual's wants and needs and desires, and into what is really being asked for from us, from the collective. So as you can hear within that, then the 11th is groups and teams, and that could be friendship circles or tribes, but it's not the ones that we grew up with necessarily, but the ones that we eventually choose, that we really move into, or the ones we perhaps keep from our younger years. And we get to explore who are we when we're put into these greater contexts. So we can hear that if we think about that triad. Sometimes as we've gone along the journey, we've looked at triads. Like, for instance, the fire house triads, where the first house of that essential self, that first seed, that first fire, the 5th house of my desires and what brings me joy and pleasure, and then the 9th house of that more philosophical, higher fire, with the fire that goes out and seeks, and the seeker who looks for that higher wisdom and higher knowing. And so we've got those 3 fire houses, and then within the earth houses, we have the 2nd house of my possessions and my things and what I can touch and grasp around me, including my body. And then the 6th house, moving into my routines and my rituals, and perhaps becoming of service and taking care of the day-to-day earthly realm. And then we move into the 10th house, which is my calling and my place in the world, and taking that place, finding my sense of authority and myself as an author of my story in the world. This 11th house is also part of a triad. So it begins in the 3rd house. And the 3rd house, if you remember back then, all the way back to when we were in the 3rd house, we're looking at the 3rd house as our siblings, our early environment, those friends, those early school experiences, and how we were shaping our air element in our lives, our way of connecting with others and our way of communicating and our way of thinking about the world. And from there, in the 3rd, we move into the 7th house. And the 7th house is also very relational, associated with Libra. It's the house of one-to-one relationships, and that's both in the sense of committed romantic relationships, but also one-to-one business partnerships, or anything where there's something contractual happening between 2 people. But the key to the 7th house is that there's always 2 people. So once we add another person to this adult form of relating, we automatically enter the 11th house. So we enter groups or teams or collective, or ultimately the collective psyche or the collective consciousness. I think that's what makes this such a fascinating realm. I feel like the next phase of exploration within the field of psychology will be an extension of what we know about the masses, what it is internally inside of a human being that isn't so personal, but is actually being picked up through the air, in a sense, through the airwaves of the culture at large, including the rules of that culture and what that culture is all about, what holds it all together, because it's based on Aquarius, which is a fixed air sign. So how do we fix the air, as in hold the air steady? It's like rules of relating. So this can be our laws, therefore, and customs and culture and what we are connected to there. Yeah, this can be, therefore, that arena of the public, ultimately the public life, the polis, as it was called in ancient Greece, which is where we get words like metropolis. We also get politics and police from. So you can hear within all of those words that it's the rules of society, but it's also how we gather. If we think about those public spaces in which we gather, in which we debate, in which we talk, in which we connect. And those places in the modern world are largely online, but there is a sense of it's still ultimately based on that place where it's the free market of ideas, and in this free market of ideas we can come together, we can debate, we can together we can find the best possible solutions for everybody that's within that society, or at least that's the goal. And as I mentioned within Aquarius, these two planets are very useful to explore for the 11th house, and those planets are Saturn on the one hand and Uranus on the other. So Saturn is the rules and the limits and the laws, kind of like the limits on what citizens can do within this particular society. And then Uranus is the other ruler of Aquarius, therefore related to the 11th house, is the one who wants to break those rules, the rebellious one, the one that wants to overturn those and revolutionize and find new ways towards new ideas and new ideals. And these are our two essential components of this house, the Saturnian of the rules and the Uranian of the breaking of the rules. Perhaps just to step down from there, if you just think for a moment for yourself, and just think to yourself, who am I when I'm in a group? Let's say we'll make it a small group, just forms. Let's say there's 12 people. We'll make it a nice astrological number. And you come into the room and you're one of these 12 participants and you sit down. What role do you tend to play within that group? And how do you feel about that group? Are you comfortable? Are you uncomfortable? Are you nervous? Are you relaxed? Like, what is it like for you? And what do you imagine might happen for you in that group? Do you imagine that things are going to go really well? Do you think you'll play a leadership role? Do you think you'll help out? Do you think you'll be of service? Do you think you'll be the one getting people cushions and chairs and making sure everybody's comfortable? Do you think you might be a spokesperson standing up for others within the group? Do you think people might look to you for certain things, or look to you for wisdom, or look to you for understanding? Or do you feel maybe that you freeze within the group, or you overthink things, or you are too much in your head? What is it about this group situation? What is it for you personally? And if you know your chart, you can then take whatever your answers were to this experiment of 12 people in a group and have a look at your chart and have a look at what's on the cusp of the 11th, that's in between the 10th and the 11th house, what the ruler of that is, and any planets that might be in the 11th house. And that can give you a little bit of a reflection on you and groups and what that feels like, but more from the archetypal and astrological perspective. You know, ultimately that's what astrology is. It's a way to reflect on the self, and it's a way to see unseen things that you might not know about yourself, may be hidden or stored here in the chart. So that is ultimately what we're looking at when it comes to the 11th. And another part of that can also be, just as in the third house, it's that relationship with siblings, right? And what our experience of our siblings was, and what we felt about our siblings, which is always a very complex thing. If you didn't have siblings, that's also what you felt about not having siblings. Like, that's still information. No siblings is still an informational piece. And then maybe you had several siblings, so several of the siblings played different roles for you. But the information for all of that tends to be associated with the third house. And what we find within the third house is what we don't in our early childhood experiences, what we disown in ourselves can have the habitual tendency to fall upon one of our siblings, which is called projection, or projection of the shadow, or projection of the gold. If we project the gold, then positive traits within ourselves tend to fall upon one of the siblings. And if we project the shadow, then perhaps our more negative traits fall on the sibling and we don't own them within ourselves. Of course, when we're talking about projection, there's also just the reality of the situation. Our siblings are their particular characters despite or regardless of whatever projection we throw at them. But you can imagine that the idea of projection just helps us to get a sense of like, well, what part of me am I owning or not owning? And we take that into the 7th house, and that can be even more pronounced. It can be what we project onto the other, that mythical, magical other that comes into our life. That can be a partner, that can be a romantic partner, somebody that we are in relationship with, or it could be a business partner. But what do we tend to disown, whether that's our gold or shadow, when it comes to that partner? And when it comes to the 11th house, what do we tend to disown or project onto the group? So perhaps we think the group is powerful because we can't see our own power within the group, or the group is edgy because we can't see our own edginess. Or maybe the group cares for me and loves me because we can't see that care and love from the internal either, right? Many different ways that could occur, but that's really a question for the 11th house. What is it that I disown and put onto the group? And then, therefore, if I want to make that solid psychological move, I can then work to retrieve that element of myself that has dislodged itself from my interior psyche and found its way onto groups in general. So that can be that question of the 11th for yourself. Of course, again, you can look at your chart and you can look at planets in there, and that could be the sorts of planets that you project out onto the group. Or they could speak to what generally your experience of the group is. And a lot of that, in psychodynamic astrology, it's really about what is our feeling about those energies. That's the most important thing. What's our feeling about those energies? How can we work to reclaim parts of ourselves that end up wandering off over there and becoming a part of this other, the other in this case being a collective other called the group? Within process work, what the general rule is that the elements of group consciousness that disturbs us is often where the gold is. So we're encouraged within Mindell's work and process-oriented psychotherapy to move towards the disturbing force. And once we find ourselves moving towards the thing, especially if we have a very strong reaction or strong response to it, that's how we can gently, slowly start to bring back to ourselves those parts of us that got caught up in the group or dislodged out there in the group. Because after all, groups and group consciousness is a big topic. It's something that has a lot of charge to it. It can feel very threatening. A group can feel very threatening to the individual. And there are many, many myths out there that explore the idea of the individual being engulfed by the group or taken by the group, or the group essentially being against the individual. Of course, groups are made up of individuals, and the best groups are often when the group itself is getting the best gold and the best genius and the best diamonds and the best performances and best experience of all of the members of the group. And in order to do that, it probably needs something to do with the Saturn and the Uranus, as in pretty good, clear structures and guidelines from Saturn, but also the ability for each of the group members to be a little bit off center, like Uranus. Uranus is that planet that is off center. It spins at a tilt. It's eccentric, so it's spinning off center. And really, to get the most out of groups, we want each individual to feel empowered within the group, but not so empowered that they become a sort of destructive Uranian force where they tear the group down just for their own means. So one other component of groups we could bring in now into this part of the exploration is that the planet that's in its joy in the 11th house is Jupiter. Jupiter, who was Zeus, the great king of the gods. And as a planet, Jupiter is the biggest planet that we have. It's a massive gas giant. It has many, many moons. It's kind of like its own solar system there. Typically thought of as a benefic planet, a benevolent planet. And so how is it that Jupiter can help us to understand the 11th house? And I think one of the ways to get that is if we go into myth. One of the great myths that I personally really love, as I'm sure you know if you've listened a bit to the podcast, is the Homeric hymn to Hermes. And it's exploring that tension that happens between Hermes and Apollo. And when Apollo eventually brings Hermes up to the great council of the gods and sits him down, this little boy who's stolen his cattle and caused all sorts of mayhem and disruption in the world, in Apollo's nicely ordered world, he sits him down in front of Zeus and he says to Hermes, "What do you have to say for yourself?" And Hermes opens up a big, even more broad and even more elaborate lie than the one he told Apollo, but then gives Zeus a wink. And when Zeus sees that wink, he starts to laugh. Once he stopped his laughter, he looks at both of his sons, Apollo and Hermes, and he says, "Well, the world needs Apollo and the world needs Hermes, so you guys go and work it out." And I think that's something that Jupiter in the 11th can really help us with, is to understand that all of the archetypes that are almost inevitable to show up within groups are necessary in some way, even if they're a bit disturbing and they don't seem to go in the way of harmony. The leader of the group, or Zeus in this case, is the one who's able to hold that tension, not condemn either side of the archetypal oppositions that happen and occur, and then allow those things to basically work themselves out. Which kind of brings us to one part of the 11th house is the idea of a self-organizing system or a self-organizing field. Is something the biologist Rupert Sheldrake referred to as a morphic field. So within these 11th house collective consciousness arrangements, there's an intelligence underneath it. And oftentimes it'll be the human that comes in and doesn't have much faith in the ability of groups to actually organize and reorganize themselves, and therefore begins to control and put things in to their right place, but in a very rigid way, thus going too far on the Saturnian side of things. Of course, on the other side, you could get too Uranian, just let the chaos happen and see what happens, which could also be not quite right. So the leader needs to be a bit like Zeus in this story, or Jupiter in this story, who's able to pay attention and feel in to what is actually happening within that group and allow for the evolution of collective consciousness to occur within the group setting. And this really reminds me of the work of Arnie Mindell when he began turning his mind to what he called world work, which is where he get around about 100 people in a room with a panel of 4 people, 4 other therapists. He would pay attention to all of the nuances and everything going on, including body movement, including all the different channels of awareness, and allow the tensions within the group to come up and surface and then reorganize themselves, almost like holding space for the reorganization of the consciousness of the group. There's a book of Mindell's called Standing in the Fire, and that's a really great book for exploring some of the actual lived experiences and stories he went through. He'd often go to places where there's a lot of violence and gang violence and stand and have representations from each side and see what would come up. And obviously with firm rules about violence and physical violence to make sure that nothing happened so it was safe enough, but then allowing expression from all the different components and from all the different elements of that group to come up, and trusting that by coming up they would reorganize themselves. And if you could do that for a group of 100 people within a community, then that kind of thing can ripple out into the whole community. I think it's a particularly interesting area of exploration, something that I feel would make a big difference in the world as we get more and more polarized and more set in our own camps. Never the twain shall meet by the seams of things these days. Like, it's very rare that you get together with people that aren't already in your own echo chamber and let the things actually take place and allow things to evolve. And it's quite the skill that Mindell and those who learnt with him along the way learnt in order to go in that high ideal and high hope, which is what is also representative of Jupiter and its joy in the 11th, those hopes and dreams of a better world, of world peace ultimately, and that we can find ways towards peace that don't involve bloodshed and violence and belittling and manipulation and all the sorts of things that occur in the world. And that the hopes and dreams of Jupiter with its joy in the 11th is that there's a better way that there's always a better way for us to organize ourselves. And that can go on the most micro level, literally for 3 people, like a small group of 3 people, right up into the level of all of humankind, like the collective consciousness of human beings on the planet. Especially as this is the house where we do make laws and international laws and agreements between different peoples and different societies. Often those societies are seeing the world from such different angles and have completely different consensus realities, but ultimately trying to bring those consensuses into some kind of a field in which everybody can operate without losing the unique individuality of each part, so that there's more and more empowerment, but not the kind of empowerment that is an overpowering or a domination, but the kind of world where people can live in freedom, in peace and harmony, and live together and really get the most out of each other. We can hear maybe within that, I use the example here of the hymn of Hermes, but Apollo is Hermes' brother, and Nietzsche explored this a lot, the tension between Apollo and Dionysus. Apollo being that order and that structure, and Dionysus being the loosening of control and the loosening of the ties that bind. And ultimately, a healthy culture really needs both of those. And that's why for most of civilization, at least in the West, most of civilization, there'd always be some kind of a feast of fools around the end of the year where there was a loosening of the grip of the roles. The master would become the slave. There'd be the little girl would become the priest and speak gibberish into the church, and instead of amen and what have you in the church, that everybody would make responses with donkey sounds and these kinds of things. A lot of this is explored from Jung in these collected works of the archetypes of the collective unconscious in his chapter on the trickster. And giving room for the trickster archetype, or giving room for the loosening of the ties that bind, is also a very important direction towards healthy societies and healthy cultures. And of course, there's less and less of that in the world these days, but maybe the resurgence of that is in the dreams of all of us that are trying to participate in healthy society and healthy civilization, how we might be able to, have those Saturnian rules, but also those Uranian ways to break and bend those rules. A lot of that is explored within Dionysus, who would come into very stuck societies and bring revelry and wine and ambrosia, take people out into the forest and explore and get naked and stomp the feet and drum and sing and allow the wild side of human nature to have a place in the world, have expression. In a sense, what was found was that would only strengthen the society. When people felt that they could be free, then they would more gladly go back to the roles that were imposed upon them. But of course, those holding the roles would often hold them very tightly and try to condemn the Dionysian, which is where the Dionysian component can become like a certain madness. It can become out of control, not because it by itself is out of control, but it has to respond to more and more tightening of the rules. And that's where things get more and more unruly. So you can hear this tension between the Apollonian and the Dionysian worlds, and how we might work within societies and civilizations, and as I said, even in those smaller ways, to keep the freedom of expression happening. Because also within the Dionysian world, you often get your more genius types, the creators, the artists, the ones with wild ideas. And it's those wild ideas that really allow cultures to thrive in the end, because if a culture is starved of wild ideas, then it loses touch of what it is to be a culture in the first place. If it loses touch with those ideas, it can become stale or bland or sterile, or ultimately kind of dull. You can hear the need for both of those, and Nietzsche obviously spent a lot of time on that. And it could be said that he himself, who died at I think it's 44 years old, very, very young, was himself torn up between those two archetypes, between Apollo and Dionysus. So these archetypes are real. They have a strong influence on us. They're a very real element of reality. And how can we take this deeper knowing, this deeper archetypal knowing, and apply it in more areas? I guess the work of Mendel that I mentioned earlier is one way to bring more of this knowing into the organizations of society at large. So the other thing about the 11th house is it's something that Jung called participation mystique, which is ultimately losing the self or losing the self to the group, which, as you can hear, within the Dionysian there, everybody's drinking the ambrosia and stomping the feet and getting into the revelry and getting into what is joyful and such a beautiful experience of losing the heavy burden that is the self and being involved in that greater collective ecstatic thing. So I wonder if something springs to mind in your life recently, hopefully recently, where you've had that positive experience of participation mystique, where you've been able to go and lose yourself in music or drumming or singing or dancing or whatever it is, chanting, anything that has allowed you to lose the firm grip of the self and join in the collective. Now, of course, the negative side of participation mystique, Jung wrote extensively about, and that's because the majority of his work was in between the wars of World War I and World War II. That was the great chunk of his career was right in there. So he witnessed participation mystique in the most negative ways, where the individuals within a society lost their individuality and joined in very destructive movements, especially towards the Second World War. It really concerned him, and he focused a lot of attention to understanding why exactly that would happen, where people that don't even believe in these ways of treating other fellow human beings would behave in that way anyway, because the collective was almost compelling them to do that. This is that double edge of participation mystique in the most negative form of the losing of the self, and then being ultimately consumed by the masses, versus the positive of losing yourself and being uplifted by the movement that is happening. And what is the difference, and how can we feel the difference? And I think the 11th house focuses our attention psychologically less into the psychology of the self and more into the psychology of the group, the psychology of the mass, and how we know when what we are participating in is ultimately a healthy and beautiful thing, and not a negative and destructive thing. And you don't have to look far through human history to see the many, many examples of the negative and destructive things, like negative cults that really take the individual away, and the group as an organism ultimately does the most destructive things. And yet so many examples also of that loosening of the self and becoming one with some greater mission or greater purpose that is ultimately for the betterment of humankind. How do we allow ourselves to be in 11th house consciousness in a healthy way? That question has been on my mind for the last few weeks as I have been pondering the 11th house, and ultimately I have found a few deities and a few ways that astrology may be able to help us with that, may be able to get us into 11th house situations with ease and with grace, and make sure that we're safe, make sure that we are able to participate in the great mysteries of groups and participate well in these morphic fields with the help of a little bit of guidance from some of our deities, some of our archetypes, some of our invisible friends that can help us along the way. So ultimately, I have felt that there's really three ways into the 11th. You could come from the 10th house, where we've just been. That's that house of career and calling and the development of the self into the world through the 10th, which is Capricorn's house, the climbing of the mountain, the strengthening and becoming of ourselves, and the MC and the midheaven and that shining star that is there above us, almost like a guardian angel from the 10th. Alternatively, we could come from the 12th house, which is the deep dreaming realm, deep dreaming consciousness, and we take our vision that was there in the 12th and we bring it up and offer it into the 11th. And the other alternative is the opposite of the 11th house, is the 5th house, and that is the house of pleasure and enjoyment and our own genius and our own development of what our gift is, and then offering it from the 5th up out into the 11th. So these are the three directions that I've been working with over the last few weeks, and let's see if they work for you here. Now, each of these directions, they also have a deity associated with them. So let's start with the 10th here. And of course, somebody that I had not actually mentioned in my exploration of the 10th house, I'm not sure if I mentioned her at all, but she definitely belongs up here, is Athena. So Athena is the virgin goddess born of Zeus's head. Her mother is Metis the Oceanid. So she has a link through her feminine lineage through to Metis and the ocean and oceanic wisdom. She's a weaver, and she is able to make beautiful and incredible tapestries, which is a great image for meaning making and the understanding of what's happened in our lives and how to offer more beauty out into the world through these tapestries. And why she belongs up here in the 10th, I believe, is, born from Zeus's head. So it's almost like in the 9th house where we got that higher wisdom, that higher understanding. From that higher understanding, she's birthed, fully formed, fully armored with her shield and with the aegis, which is her breastplate, and also her spear, her sword, everything that she needs for the world, fully armored, sharp, with a piercing eye that can see very long distances. The owl is also related to her, the swiveling neck that can see all directions and can see in the darkness. So that kind of piercing vision that is birthed from the 9th into the 10th, and then upstanding the rules of civilization, and particularly her role as the helper and the guide, the mentor of heroes. In fact, the word mentor comes from Athena early on in the Odyssey, where she arrives as mentor for Telemachus, who's the son of Odysseus, and she's able to guide him on his journey, guide him on his mission to retrieve his father from the deep sea. And she shows up again and again to help the hero, the heroic consciousness. That's what she loves, and she wants the heroes to come forward to protect and to honor and to create within the world of that 10th house, bringing ourselves and our gifts into the world. And so the bridge that she can build for us is from the 10th house, when we've really developed ourselves and who we are, and build that bridge over into the 11th. So it's a very stable bridge, this one. It has a lot of earthliness to it. It's almost like just an extension of where Capricorn, the mountain goat, the sure-footedness can take us. It's based on the achievements that we've made. As I said last time, the word chief comes up here. Dane Rudhyar's word was achievement, and taking that part of ourselves and entering the world with authority and with a command of ourselves, and then offering that to the group as wherever it might be best needed. And that would be Athena's vision ultimately for entering the 11th. Of course, Dane Rudhyar's word for the 11th is the word transfigure, which he also used the word metamorphosis. This transfiguration of taking our hard-earned gifts as they've been shaped into the world like that sacred oak tree, but then delivering it to the 11th, building that bridge over and giving what we have to the collective, and in a really solid and foundational way. And I'm sure Athena can be there whispering in our ear, helping us along the way, helping us when the chips are down, helping us when we're feeling that sense of not worthy and who am I to even offer anything to the world, or whatever it is that we come up with, and being able to talk with this fierce guide of Athena as she encourages us to keep going and keep moving through the struggles of life, and to offer what we have in this sacred life to what the collective ultimately needs. So that's one direction from the 10th, a very valuable and valid direction for us to get into the 11th. If we're going from the 10th, it's what we call zodiacal motion, which is, this podcast is also following the zodiacal motion from the 1st all the way through to the 12th. But there's another motion, and something that I've talked about a little bit in the podcast. Amanda Simon and I went into it, Travis and I went into it, and Jason and I will go into it next podcast when I interview him for the 11th. We'll go into that distinction between the zodiacal motion 1 through 12 and the diurnal motion, which is 12 through 1. So it's going the completely opposite direction. It's going basically clockwise versus anti-clockwise. In that case, we're coming from the deep dreaming archetypal collective unconscious of the 12th house, which will be our next stop along the way, of course, but the deep dreaming mind. And we're taking what comes from the deep dreaming and just offering that straight into the collective of the 11th. Something of the visionary, something of what we can perceive that the 11th house, this collective, could ultimately use, from almost like a prophetic vision that is able to see with the dreaming mind, with the, we might say the right brain, with the creative mind, and taking our 12th house consciousness and offering it straight up into the 11th. So a path that goes from the dreaming mind into the collective is going to need, again, a really good solid guide. And the best guide for a situation like that would be Hermes, the psychopomp, because of course the psychopomp is one who can take us from one state of consciousness to the other, can take us from the underworld and back up to the upper world, and can definitely take us from that oceanic, Piscean, Neptunian realm of the deep dreaming and help us to give it form and help us to translate, which is what Hermes as a messenger is all about. Translate that vision into something that can be really useful right now in the collective consciousness. So we ask Hermes to help us come from that dreaming, from that visionary place without losing the essence of that, but also being able to translate it in a way that can be understood in the collective and can be useful and can, again, bring vibrancy and bring beauty to this place of the 11th. Because after all, I do believe that the 11th house is ultimately about what the ancient world called Aphrodite Urania, which is Aphrodite of the heavens, which is the seeking of some kind of cosmic order and being able to see that there's a beauty underneath that cosmology in a way, like the cosmic order, that there's a beauty there, and that the human being, rather than being the one that imposes order, is the one that listens to order and listens to Aphrodite of the heavens, Aphrodite Urania, and listens to the beauty that she has for the world, the plan that she has for the world, and perhaps putting down some of what the human beings have as a plan, because we as human beings are corruptible in just so many countless ways, and we really need something more of the divine order of things, the cosmic order of things, which actually brings us back into the 5th house, because the 5th house is that house of pleasure. Aphrodite, again, Venus is in its joy there in the 5th. But in the 5th, it's more Aphrodite Pandemos, which is the idea of Aphrodite of the people rather than Aphrodite of the heavens. We're not necessarily in the 5th seeking out some divine perfection in things. We're seeking out more what makes me happy, what gives me pleasure, what gives me joy, what gives me satisfaction, and that being our way of really connecting to ourselves and connecting deeper into what our genius is and connecting deeper into what it is that we have to offer by following our pleasure and following our joy. We talked back in the 5th house with Libri Rose Waite, where we explored Persephone through the 5th house. We also had Vive Oldham in here, who is doing some amazing work on what it means to really follow pleasure as a principle to help our nervous systems and to help us relax and to help us be in the enjoyment of life and not just kind of cogs in the machine, and how those things can take us deeper into who we are as an individual, as a self. And so that's the tension ultimately between the 5th house and the 11th house. The 5th house is the self and everything that the self has within it. And the offering of that self out into the 11th house is that bridge. And it's a long bridge because it's an opposition, but that bridge between the 5th all the way out to the 11th. So who might help us make such a journey, such a quest in a sense? Who might take us all the way over those bridges? Well, this one's a little bit more of a complex arrangement of mythological motifs, but I think if you stay with me, it's going to help us get a sense of like, what do we need to make that journey from the 5th over to the 11th? And I want to start with Hercules, the great hero. And I want to start with Hercules in his first labor. I wrote about this in my newsletter recently, but Hercules in his first labor, he wrestles with a lion, a giant lion, the Nemean lion. He wrestles with this lion underneath a great mountain in a tunnel. He's blocked off one side of the tunnel, so neither he nor the lion can get out. He fires his arrows at the lion, but it just bounces off because it has impenetrable skin. But he wrestles with this lion, which is in a sense wrestling with ourselves as individuals, wrestling with the angel, wrestling with the daimon, wrestling with the demon, so that we can really strengthen ourselves as individuals through this wrestling match with like, who am I, who am I, who am I, and really wrestling that out. And once eventually he's able to defeat the lion, he takes the pelt of the lion and he puts it on his head, by putting this on his head, he basically integrates lion consciousness. As astrologers, we can understand that as Leo consciousness, or the ability to truly be who we are in this world. And then he heads out into the world and he achieves the rest of his labors, which essentially is him going back out into the 11th to get his redemption and to offer his gifts as the 5th house hero out into the 11th house by following the rules that are given to him, even though those rules are desperately unfair and they don't make a lot of sense. He doesn't complain. He just keeps on going and keeps on going. So that's the Herculean side. But I actually want to go one step deeper with this analysis, because actually during his 4th labor, where he was going to retrieve a boar, he actually goes on a little side quest. And that side quest is very important. Speaking of Jason Holly, Jason and I also did this last year. We went through the story of Jason and the Argonauts. And it's a really interesting dynamic between 5th house and 11th house process, and what it means to be a true leader, and how that idea of what a leader actually is evolves over time, and maybe evolves in our thinking, evolves in our perception. Because, of course, Hercules as a leader would do everything, and because he's the strongest and he's the best. So when Hercules is around, he just does it all. So when Jason and the Argonauts got together, Hercules, of course, came along because he wouldn't miss out on one of these Avenger-like situations where all of the heroes are getting together. He wants to be involved. In the first part of the story of Jason and the Argonauts, it's always Hercules that's sent to do whatever it is. If he's in the middle of the boat, he's rowing hard, he's going to do everything, he's going to fight everyone, he's going to take care of everything. But then, interestingly enough, Hercules gets pulled away by his assistant, Hylas, who's essentially like his water bearer, which is a little bit Aquarian. And as Hylas, the cupbearer, is heading off on this particular island to get some water for Hercules, he's drawn in by these water nymphs, and he's taken under the water. And Hercules is incredibly distressed and goes after him on this island and gets so focused on trying to find Hylas that in the end the boat goes off without him. And so Jason and the rest of the gang are off back out to sea, but now they don't have their central solar figure of Hercules. But as things settle, what you find in the rest of the story is that the gifts of the others on the boat are really called forward, much more so. And it's almost like the self-organizing field begins to take over. A more 11th house system starts to take over, where the gifts of all of those on the crew are called forward because that central figure, the sun, or the Herculean or the heroic, is no longer around to do everything for everybody. And so this, in a sense, is very 11th house. Without that central solar figure, without that central force, we can then see what happens as a field reorganizes itself, and reorganizes itself so powerfully and so beautifully, bringing forth the gifts of all of the others that are along for the journey, and each of them having their own moment to shine, and a sense of far greater cohesion within the group once that central figure is no longer with them. And so I wonder if we feel into that within yourself. If you have a part of yourself that's always the one doing in your life, always the one stepping forward, always that central solar figure, and what it might be like to send that one off to Hylas, or send Hylas off to carry some water, and let Hylas get lost, and then let the Hercules inside of you, the big heroic ego inside of you, also get a bit lost and confused and dazed and wander off. And although that could be very troubling and very confusing, and the reorganization of the field can feel very chaotic, I wonder if, like Jason and the Argonauts, we could imagine that it may lead to a better style of leadership within your own system. It may lead to other parts of yourself being called forward, other parts of yourself shining, and almost as though that whole internal tribe that you are, that whole internal family that you are, is then able to come forward. And you may find out things about yourself that you never knew before, because you've put the ego to rest, or you put that central solar power away, and you've allowed other parts of yourself to come forward. I wonder how that also applies to smaller groups that you might be a part of, allowing for the evolution of leadership to not be the one that does everything, but to be the one that calls forth others to do what they are there to do, calls forth the gifts of others, calls forth the gold that is hidden within the field. That can really uplift not just each individual within that system, but also the system itself, so it can become stronger, more resilient, more creative, and ultimately do what Aphrodite Urania is wanting us to do, which is to make a world that is more beautiful, incrementally more beautiful, by moving one small group at a time in the direction of greater beauty and cohesion and harmony. So there we go. Thanks a lot for coming on this exploration of the 11th house with me. I hope that has enlightened a little bit of your own 11th house. Feel free to jump on the Patreon there and converse with us and post and tell me your own experiences of your own 11th house, or what's moved you in this episode, or what's got your imagination ticking along. I'd really love to hear that. Patreon is the best place to do that. You can join for free, or you can offer a little bit of money into the tip jar. Either way, you become a part of that conversation. We'd love to hear from you. Next week, I will be talking, as I said, with Jason Holly. We've already had this conversation, and it's one that we're both really looking forward to releasing and sending out into the world. We had a really wonderful conversation, and I'm very much looking forward to bringing that out to you next week. And in the meanwhile, be safe, enjoy those 11th house explorations, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you for listening to On the Soul's Terms podcast. To support the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review, sharing with friends, or becoming a patron at patreon.com/onthesoulsterms. Until next time.